Hello, dear friend, and welcome to this quiet corner of history. Tonight, we set aside the noise of the present and wander gently into the stories of the past. Whether you're curled up beneath the blankets, resting after a long day, or simply seeking calm company for your evening, I'm grateful you've chosen to be here. If you'd like, share in the comments where in the world you're listening from. I always love seeing how far this community stretches across time zones and continents. And if these soothing journeys through history bring you comfort, consider subscribing so we can meet again. For now, let's loosen the weight of the modern world and step softly into the echoes of yesterday. Close your eyes for a moment, if you will, and picture the sea at dawn. The water stretches endlessly in every direction, its surface catching the first pale light of morning like scattered diamonds. The air is cool and salt-heavy, filling your lungs with the taste of distant shores. A ship rocks gently on the swells, its timbers creaking with the rhythm of the waves, its sails hanging limp in the pre-dawn stillness. This is the romantic vision we often carry of life at sea, the image painted by adventure stories and Hollywood films: freedom, treasure, exotic ports, and the wind in your hair as you stand at the bow of a galleon, master of your own destiny. But now, let that image fade, and replace it with something closer to the truth. The same ship, yes, but look more carefully now. See the deck stained dark with old blood that no amount of scrubbing can remove. Notice the smell, not just salt air, but unwashed bodies, rotting wood, bilge water thick with filth, and the metallic tang of fear. Listen to the sounds, not stirring sea shanties, but the groan of hungry men, the scrape of chains, the desperate prayers whispered in the dark. Feel the ship's motion again, but this time recognize it for what it truly is. The constant, nauseating roll that never stops, that makes your stomach churn and your head spin, that denies you rest even in sleep. This is the reality of pirate life, the truth beneath the legend. And tonight, we're going to explore that reality together, not with melodrama or sensationalism, but with the quiet honesty of historical record. We'll walk the decks of these vessels, meet the men and women who sailed them, and understand why, despite everything we've been told, the life of a pirate was not an adventure to be envied, but an ordeal to be survived, and often, not even that. The very word pirate conjures images that have been carefully crafted over centuries of storytelling. We think of Long John Silver with his parrot and his charm, of Captain Jack Sparrow with his swagger and his seemingly magical ability to escape any danger, of treasure maps and desert islands and chests overflowing with gold doubloons. These stories serve a purpose. They entertain us. They let us imagine ourselves as daring outlaws answering to no authority, living free on the open ocean. But like most romanticized versions of history, they bear only the faintest resemblance to the actual experience of the people who lived these lives. The truth is, piracy was born not from a love of adventure but from desperation, violence, and the brutal economic realities of the age of sail. To understand why men became pirates, we must first understand the world they inhabited, a world where the ocean was not a playground but a killing field, where national navies impressed sailors against their will, where merchant ships treated their crews little better than slaves, and where the line between legal privateer and illegal pirate was often nothing more than which government had issued your letter of marque. Let us begin, then, not with the pirates themselves, but with the sea that shaped them. The ocean in the 17th and 18th centuries was a very different place from the one we know today. There were no GPS satellites to tell you exactly where you were, no weather forecasts to warn of approaching storms, no Coast Guard to rescue you if things went wrong, no international maritime law to protect you from abuse. The sea was a vast unknown, mapped only imperfectly, filled with dangers both natural and human, governed by nothing but the law of survival. Imagine yourself standing on a dock in London or Bristol or any of the great port cities of Europe around the year 1690. The harbor is thick with ships, great three-masted merchant vessels bound for the East Indies or the Caribbean, smaller coastal traders, fishing boats, naval warships bristling with cannon. The air is filled with a cacophony of sound, the cry of seabirds, the shouts of sailors and stevedores, the creak of rope and wood, the splash of oars, the ring of hammers from the shipyards. The smell is overwhelming: tar and paint, fish and salt, sewage and smoke, spices from distant lands, rum from the West Indies, the distinctive odor of wet hemp rope. Now picture a young man, perhaps 16 or 17 years old, standing on that same dock. He might be there for any number of reasons. Perhaps he's the son of a poor family with too many mouths to feed, and the sea represents the only employment he can find. Perhaps he's running from debt or a failed apprenticeship or a crime he's committed. Perhaps he's simply been impressed, grabbed off the street by a press gang and forced into naval service against his will, a practice that was entirely legal and terrifyingly common. Or perhaps, and this is rarer than the stories would have you believe, he's actually seeking adventure, drawn by tales of distant lands and the promise of fortune. Whatever his reasons, once he signs aboard a ship, or is forced aboard against his will, his life changes in ways he cannot yet imagine. Let us follow him now, this hypothetical young sailor, and see what his life will become. We'll call him Thomas, though he could just as easily be John or William or James or any of 1,000 other names recorded in the muster rolls of the period. Thomas doesn't know it yet, but within a year, circumstances will transform him from a merchant sailor into a pirate. Not because he's particularly wicked or bloodthirsty, but simply because he'll be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and because survival will demand it. His first experience of shipboard life comes as a profound shock. The merchant vessel he's joined is bound for the Caribbean with a cargo of manufactured goods, cloth, tools, weapons, luxury items for the colonial elite. The ship is perhaps 100 feet long, three-masted, built for cargo capacity rather than speed or comfort. Thomas is assigned to a crew of about 30 men, all of whom will live in the cramped space below decks when they're not on watch. That space, when Thomas first sees it, makes him want to turn and run. The ceiling is so low he cannot stand upright. The only light comes from a few small hatches, and even at midday it's dim as twilight. The air is thick and foul, all those unwashed bodies packed together, the smell of the bilge water sloshing beneath the floorboards, the odor of damp wood and mildew. There are no beds, only hammocks slung so close together that they touch, swaying with the ship's motion. There is no privacy whatsoever. Meals are eaten sitting on sea chests or coils of rope. The latrine, such as it is, consists of a seat suspended over the side of the ship, which means relieving yourself in full view of anyone who happens to be nearby, while waves splash up from below. The food, Thomas learns quickly, is barely adequate even at the start of a voyage, and will only get worse as time goes on. The diet consists primarily of hardtack, a type of biscuit baked so hard it could last for months, though by the end of a long voyage it would be infested with weevils that the sailors would learn to ignore. There's salted beef or pork, preserved in barrels of brine, so tough and salty it has to be soaked before eating. There are dried peas and beans, occasionally some cheese, and a daily ration of beer or rum because water stored in wooden casks quickly becomes undrinkable, thick with algae and alive with microorganisms. The work itself is backbreaking and never-ending. The ship operates on a watch system, 4 hours on duty, 4 hours off, around the clock, every single day regardless of weather or circumstance. When Thomas is on watch, he might be climbing the rigging to adjust sails, hauling on ropes to change the ship's heading, manning the bilge pumps to keep the ship from slowly filling with seawater, or simply standing lookout, scanning the horizon for other ships or signs of land. When he's off watch, he's expected to maintain the ship, scraping barnacles, repairing sails, replacing worn rope, caulking leaks. There is no such thing as a day off, no weekends, no holidays. The officers who command the ship are distant figures, occupying a separate world from the common sailors. The captain has his own cabin in the stern, with actual windows and a degree of comfort unimaginable to the men forward. The mates and the bosun have slightly better quarters. These men eat better food, drink better rum, have servants to wait on them. The distance between officers and crew is not just physical but social, almost like the gap between nobles and peasants. The captain's word is absolute law, and his power over the crew is backed by the threat of violence. Discipline on merchant ships of this era is maintained through brutality. A sailor who fails in his duties, who talks back to an officer, who is caught stealing from the cargo or his shipmates, can expect to be flogged with a cat o' nine tails, a whip with 9 knotted cords that tears the flesh with each stroke. For more serious offenses, a man might be keel-hauled, dragged beneath the ship from one side to the other, the barnacles on the hull shredding his body if he doesn't drown first. Or he might be marooned, left on a deserted island with nothing but a pistol and a single shot, ostensibly to give him the choice of how he dies, though in practice most marooned men died slowly of thirst and starvation. Thomas witnesses his first flogging 3 weeks into the voyage. A sailor named Robert has been caught sleeping on watch, a serious offense because an unattended ship can run aground or collide with another vessel. The entire crew is called on deck to witness the punishment. Robert is stripped to the waist and tied to the grating, his back exposed. The bosun wields the cat o' nine tails, bringing it down with practiced accuracy. The first stroke leaves 9 parallel welts across Robert's shoulders. The second draws blood. By the 10th stroke, Robert's back is a mass of torn flesh, blood running down to soak his trousers. By the 20th, he's barely conscious, held upright only by his bonds. The captain awards 30 strokes, and when Robert is finally cut down, he collapses on the deck, unable to stand. Thomas watches this with growing horror, but he learns quickly that showing sympathy for the punished men is dangerous. The officers are watching the crew's reactions, looking for signs of insubordination or weakness. Any man who speaks out against the punishment, who helps Robert without permission, who shows too much emotion, risks being next. So Thomas stands silent, his face carefully neutral, and when the punishment is over and Robert is dragged below decks, Thomas returns to his duties as if nothing has happened. But something has changed inside him. He understands now that he is not an employee who can quit if he doesn't like his job. He is more like property, bound to the ship until the voyage ends, subject to the absolute authority of men who see him as barely human. The voyage continues. Days blend into weeks, weeks into months. The ship follows the trade winds south and west, heading for the Caribbean islands that have become the jewels in the crown of European colonial empires. Thomas learns the rhythms of shipboard life, learns which officers to avoid and which might show a moment of mercy, learns how to work the rigging even in the worst weather, learns to eat weevil-infested hardtack without thinking about it, learns to sleep in his hammock despite the constant motion and the snoring and coughing of 30 other men packed into the space around him. He also learns about the diseases that stalk every ship on the ocean. Scurvy is the worst. A slow wasting disease caused by lack of vitamin C, though no one in this era understands the cause. Men with scurvy watch their gums swell and bleed, their teeth loosen and fall out, old wounds reopen, bruises appear all over their bodies, their strength ebbs away until they can't work, can't eat, can barely breathe. On a long voyage, scurvy might kill half the crew or more. Thomas sees 3 men die of it before the ship reaches the Caribbean, their bodies sewn into canvas and dropped over the side with minimal ceremony. There are other threats too. Typhoid and dysentery spread easily in the cramped, unsanitary conditions below decks. Men sicken suddenly, racked by fever and diarrhea, becoming dangerously dehydrated in a matter of days. Some recover, many don't. There's no real medical care. The ship carries no doctor, just a carpenter who can perform amputations if necessary and a sea chest with a few basic medicines, alcohol for disinfecting wounds, opium for pain, mercury for treating syphilis. Most illness is treated with rum and prayer, and a surprising number of men pray very fervently indeed once they realize how fragile their lives truly are. After 3 months at sea, the ship finally reaches Bridgetown, Barbados. The sight of land after so long on the open ocean affects Thomas in ways he doesn't expect. His eyes, accustomed to the endless monotony of water and sky, struggle to process the riot of green vegetation, the white sand beaches, the colorful buildings of the port town. His legs, used to the constant motion of the ship, find the stable ground strangely disorienting. Everything smells different, flowers and earth and cooking food, smells he'd almost forgotten existed. The Caribbean in the 1690s is a place of extraordinary wealth and extraordinary violence. The sugar plantations that cover the islands produce fortunes for their owners, all of it built on the backs of enslaved Africans who die by the thousands in the brutal conditions of the cane fields. The port towns are chaotic, diverse, dangerous places where representatives of several European powers rub shoulders with sailors from around the world, with enslaved people and indentured servants, with privateers and merchants and planters. Violence is commonplace, duels, brawls, murders occur with numbing regularity. The law, such as it is, exists primarily to protect property and maintain the racial hierarchy that keeps the colonial system functioning. Thomas and his shipmates are given shore leave, though they must return to the ship each night. They have a little money in their pockets, their pay is meager, but it's more than they've had in months at sea. The taverns near the docks welcome them with open arms, eager to separate sailors from their wages. Thomas drinks rum for the first time in his life, not the watered-down beer that was his ration aboard ship, but the real thing, strong enough to burn going down, sweet and potent. The alcohol goes straight to his head after months of deprivation, and the world takes on a pleasant blur. In the tavern, he hears stories. Sailors from other ships, privateers, even men who quietly admit to being pirates, all telling tales of their adventures. There's a man missing his left hand, replaced by a crude hook, who describes a battle with a Spanish treasure fleet. Another man, scarred and weathered, speaks of taking a merchant ship off the coast of Africa, shares the treasure out fairly among all the crew. A third man, drunk and boastful, claims to have sailed with Henry Every, the pirate who captured the Mogul treasure ship Ganjai Sawai and became one of the richest men in the world. These stories plant something in Thomas's mind, a dangerous seed that will grow in the coming weeks. He begins to notice things he hadn't paid attention to before. The gross inequality between officers and crew on his own ship. The way the captain dines on fresh food while the crew eats moldy hardtack. The casual cruelty with which the mates treat ordinary sailors. The fact that he's been at sea for 3 months, worked until his hands bled, lived in conditions barely fit for animals, and his share of the profits amounts to perhaps 3 or 4 pounds, less than a skilled craftsman might earn in a month ashore. The ship leaves Barbados with a cargo of sugar and rum bound for London. But 2 weeks into the return voyage, Thomas's life changes forever. The ship is sailing through the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola when a sail is spotted on the horizon. At first, no one is particularly concerned, these waters are busy with traffic. But as the other ship draws closer, the captain orders the crew to battle stations, and Thomas realizes something is wrong. The approaching ship is a sloop, smaller than their merchant vessel but faster and more maneuverable. She carries far more crew than a normal merchant ship would need. Thomas can see dozens of men crowding her deck. And she's flying no national flag, just a plain black banner. The captain orders more sail set, trying to outrun the sloop, but their heavy merchant vessel is no match for the pirates' sleek ship. Within 2 hours, the sloop has closed to cannon range. What follows is not the glorious battle of stories and legend. The pirate ship fires a warning shot that passes just over their heads. The captain immediately orders the colors struck and heaves to, surrendering without a fight. He knows that resistance would be futile. The pirates outnumber them 2 to 1, have more guns, and most importantly, have nothing to lose. If a merchant crew fights back and loses, they can expect no mercy. But if they surrender peacefully, they'll likely be allowed to live. The pirates swarm aboard, a frightening collection of men who look barely human after months at sea. They're sunburned and scarred, some missing teeth or fingers or eyes, armed with cutlasses and pistols and axes. But they're not the mindless brutes Thomas expected. They're organized, efficient. Half of them secure the merchant crew, herding them forward while keeping weapons trained on them. The other half begins searching the ship, looking for valuables, money, weapons, navigational instruments, anything portable and valuable. The pirate captain comes aboard, and Thomas gets his first real look at a genuine pirate commander. This is not Long John Silver with his colorful coat and his educated accent. This man is perhaps 35 years old, burned dark by the sun, with scars on his face and arms that speak of violence survived. He's dressed practically in canvas trousers and a simple shirt, with a brace of pistols across his chest and a cutlass at his side. But there's an intelligence in his eyes that Thomas recognizes, and when he speaks to the merchant captain, his voice is calm and reasonable. The pirates' terms are simple. They'll take the cargo and anything else valuable. They'll take food, water, powder, and shot. They'll take any sailor who wishes to join them, and here the pirate captain turns to address the merchant crew directly. He tells them that life aboard a pirate ship is hard but fair. Every man gets an equal share of any prize. Every man has a vote in important decisions. Officers are elected, not appointed by owners who've never been to sea. Discipline is maintained, but it's nothing like the brutal punishments common on merchant and naval vessels. Any man who wants to join them is welcome. Any man who doesn't will be left aboard this ship with enough supplies to reach port safely. Thomas finds himself faced with a choice he never expected to make. He can stay aboard this merchant vessel, continue his brutal existence as near slave to the officers, make his pittance of wages while risking death by disease or storm or simple overwork. Or he can join the pirates, become an outlaw, live outside the law and all its protections, but have a chance, perhaps the only chance he'll ever have, at something better. He's not alone in his temptation. As the pirate captain speaks, Thomas can see other men in the merchant crew listening carefully, weighing their options. The life they've been living is so hard, so unrewarding, that piracy begins to look not like a terrible choice but like a reasonable one. Not a fall into wickedness, but a step towards something more fair, more honest in its way than the legal world that treats them as disposable. When the pirate captain calls for volunteers, Thomas steps forward. So do 6 other men from the merchant crew. They're brought aboard the pirate sloop, while the merchant vessel is allowed to sail on with the remainder of its crew, lighter by its cargo but otherwise unharmed. Just like that, Thomas has become a pirate. There's no ceremony, no dramatic moment of commitment. It's a practical decision made for practical reasons, and yet it will define the rest of his life, however long that life may prove to be. Life aboard the pirate sloop is different from anything Thomas has known. The ship herself is smaller than the merchant vessel, perhaps 60 feet long, but she's built for speed rather than cargo capacity. She carries a single mast with a fore and aft rigged sail that allows her to sail closer to the wind than a square-rigged ship. She mounts 10 cannon, 5 on each side, and carries a crew of 70 men. Far more than would normally work such a small vessel, but necessary because pirates need superior numbers to take prizes without heavy fighting. The crew is surprisingly diverse. There are English sailors like Thomas, but also French, Dutch, Portuguese, a few Scots and Irish, some escaped African slaves, even a couple of Native Americans from the mainland. They speak a polyglot mixture of languages, but everyone can communicate in the rough pidgin English that serves as the common tongue of the Caribbean. What unites them is not nationality or ethnicity but shared experience. They're all men who have been failed by the legal world, who have found in piracy something that civilization denied them. Thomas learns quickly that pirate ships operate according to a detailed code of conduct that every man must swear to uphold. These articles vary from ship to ship, but certain elements are common to most pirate crews. Every man gets one share of any prize, with perhaps an extra half share for skilled positions like the carpenter or the surgeon, and a share and a half for the captain and quartermaster. Major decisions, where to sail, what ships to attack, how to divide unusual prizes, are put to a vote, with every man having an equal say. Cowardice in battle, stealing from shipmates, sneaking women aboard without permission, fighting with other crew members, these offenses are spelled out clearly, along with their punishments. The punishments themselves are more restrained than those on legal vessels. While a Royal Navy ship might award a man 100 lashes for a minor offense, a pirate ship is more likely to impose fines or temporary loss of privileges. The worst punishment is marooning, reserved for the most serious crimes like murdering a shipmate or betraying the crew to authorities. The goal is not to terrorize the crew into obedience but to maintain order while preserving the consent of the governed. Thomas also learns about the compensation system for injury. If a man loses his right arm in battle, he receives 600 pieces of 8 from the common fund. A left arm is worth 500, a right leg 500, a left leg 400. An eye or a finger is worth 100. This is actually written into the articles that every man signs, a form of insurance that recognizes the very real risks they all face. No legal navy or merchant company offers anything comparable. If you're injured in their service, you're simply thrown ashore to beg or starve. The quartermaster of the pirate ship takes Thomas under his wing, teaching him the particular skills that pirate life requires. There's navigation. For one thing, Thomas must learn to take readings with a cross staff, to calculate the ship's position by dead reckoning, to recognize the signs of approaching weather. There's gunnery. How to load and fire the cannon, how to adjust for the ship's motion and the distance to target, how to aim for the rigging if you want to disable a ship or for the hull if you want to sink it. There's small arms combat, how to handle a cutlass, how to reload a pistol quickly, how to fight in the close quarters of a boarding action. But perhaps most importantly, Thomas must learn to read other ships. The quartermaster teaches him to recognize different types of vessels from their silhouette and rigging, to estimate their crew size from the amount of canvas they're carrying, to judge whether a ship will fight or surrender based on how she handles. Pirates are not suicidal, they want prizes, not battles. The ideal target is a slow, undermanned merchant vessel carrying valuable cargo, preferably with a captain who'll surrender at the first shot. The goal is not glorious combat but efficient theft. The daily routine aboard the pirate sloop is surprisingly normal. Men stand watches, maintain the ship, prepare meals, repair sails and rigging. When there's no prize in sight, discipline relaxes considerably. Men gather on deck in the evening to tell stories, to sing, to gamble with dice or cards. Some of them can read, and they'll share a treasured book or newspaper, passing it from hand to hand until it falls apart from overuse. Others practice music on fiddles or flutes or improvised instruments, and dancing is common. The sailors partner each other in rough approximations of the dances they remember from taverns ashore. There's also a degree of democracy that would be shocking to anyone familiar only with legal vessels. When decisions need to be made, the quartermaster calls a vote. Should they sail north toward the shipping lanes from Virginia, or south toward the Spanish Main? Should they attack that merchant brig on the horizon, or let it pass because it's flying the flag of a nation some of the crew don't want to antagonize? Should they careen the ship to scrape her bottom and repair her hull, or keep cruising in hopes of another prize? Every man's voice counts equally, and the majority rules. This democracy has practical origins. Pirate crews are held together by mutual consent rather than legal authority. If too many men become dissatisfied with the captain's leadership, they'll simply vote him out and elect a new one. If a significant portion of the crew wants to leave, they can demand that they be set ashore at a safe port with their share of the takings. The pirate ship is not a tyranny but a cooperative venture, and it only functions as long as everyone agrees to keep cooperating. Thomas experiences this firsthand about a month after joining the crew. The captain has been leading them on an unsuccessful cruise, several weeks without a prize, and supplies are running low. Some of the crew begin to grumble that he's not aggressive enough, that he's passing up opportunities. A delegation brings their concerns to the quartermaster, who calls for a general assembly. On the deck, with the ship hove to under a cloudless sky, the entire crew debates the captain's leadership. The captain defends himself, explaining his caution as wisdom rather than cowardice. But when the vote is called, it goes against him. He's removed from command, not violently, not shamefully, simply reduced to the rank of common sailor. A new captain is elected, a more aggressive man who promises better hunting. This casual deposing of authority would be mutiny on any legal vessel, punishable by hanging. But here it's accepted procedure, and the deposed captain accepts his demotion with surprising grace. He'll serve as an ordinary crew member now, and if he proves himself, he might be elected to a position of authority again in the future. The system works because everyone benefits from its success and suffers from its failure equally. Under the new captain's leadership, the crew's fortunes improve. They take a merchant sloop carrying tobacco from Virginia, adding her cargo to their hold and burning the empty vessel. 2 weeks later, they catch a Spanish merchant ship heavy with sugar and rum and pieces of 8, enough to give every man £100 when the treasure is divided, more money than Thomas could have earned in 2 years aboard a legal ship. The prize also yields fresh food, wine, clothing, and trade goods that the crew divides according to their needs and the luck of the draw. But Thomas is learning that life as a pirate is feast or famine. The £100 he earns from the Spanish prize represents perhaps 6 months of work, weeks of cruising, maintaining the ship, standing watch, with nothing to show for it except the daily rum ration and hardtack, punctuated by a single successful prize. When the crew puts into an isolated cove in the Bahamas to careen the ship and make repairs, Thomas goes ashore with money in his pocket and nothing to spend it on except the 10 taverns that spring up wherever pirates gather, run by enterprising merchants who know their customers. The money goes quickly. Rum is expensive when it has to be transported to isolated anchorages. So are women, when they can be found at all. Though Thomas will learn that the pirate's reputation for sexual violence is somewhat exaggerated. The truth is more complex and more human. Some pirates have wives or lovers in various ports who they support with their takings. Others form attachments to women who work in the taverns and brothels that serve the maritime trade. Still others seem to have relationships with their fellow pirates that are quietly tolerated despite the official prohibition against such attachments. The line between what was acceptable and what was forbidden was often more flexible in practice than the written article suggested. The careening process itself is brutal work. The ship must be beached at high tide, then rolled onto her side as the tide goes out, exposing the hull. The crew scrapes away the accumulated growth of barnacles and weed, burns off parasites with torches, then coats the clean wood with a mixture of tar and sulfur to protect it from rot and discourage new growth. It's hot, dirty, exhausting work, but essential. A ship with a fouled bottom loses speed, and speed is life for pirates who must outrun naval vessels sent to hunt them. While the ship is being careened, the crew also makes other repairs. Sails are patched or replaced, rigging is checked for wear, the cannon are cleaned and tested, hull planks damaged by shipworms are cut out and replaced. Some of the men hunt in the surrounding forest, bringing back wild pigs or sea turtles to supplement their diet. Others fish from the beach, adding fresh protein to their meals. For a few weeks, life takes on an almost holiday atmosphere, and Thomas begins to understand why some men choose this life despite its dangers. But the dangers are very real, and Thomas encounters them soon enough. The crew votes to sail north toward the shipping lanes off Carolina, hoping to intercept merchant vessels carrying naval stores, tar, pitch, turpentine, lumber, from the American colonies to England. These are valuable cargoes, always in demand, easy to sell even on the black market. The ship sails north, riding the Gulf Stream, making good time in fair weather. They've been cruising for 2 weeks when the lookout spots a sail. The pirates give chase, and as they draw closer, they identify their target as a merchant brig, moderately sized, well-built, probably carrying a valuable cargo. The pirate sloop closes rapidly, and when they're within cannon range, they fire a warning shot and run up their black flag. But instead of surrendering, the merchant ship returns fire and tries to flee. What follows is Thomas's first real taste of combat, and it bears no resemblance to the clean, heroic battles of stories. The pirate ship pursues for hours, periodically firing at the merchant vessel's rigging, trying to slow her down. When they finally come alongside, the pirates fire a broadside at close range that tears through the merchant ship's hull, killing and wounding several of her crew. Then comes the boarding action. Dozens of pirates swarm across, screaming and firing their pistols, trying to terrify the merchant crew into surrendering. Thomas finds himself in the middle of a chaotic melee, men fighting hand-to-hand on a deck slippery with blood, the air thick with smoke and the smell of gunpowder and death. He sees a man's head split open by a cutlass stroke, brain matter and blood spraying across the deck. He sees a pirate shot at point-blank range, the ball entering his chest and exiting his back, leaving a wound the size of a fist. He sees a merchant sailor begging for mercy, only to be run through by a pirate who's lost control in the heat of battle. The merchant crew breaks and surrenders within minutes, but those minutes feel like hours to Thomas. When the fighting ends, he finds himself shaking uncontrollably, his hands covered in blood, some his own from a slash across his forearm, some belonging to a man he might have killed, he's not certain. The pirate surgeon bandages his wound roughly, tells him he's lucky it's not deeper, and moves on to men with more serious injuries. The prize yields a good cargo, naval stores as expected, but also some smuggled goods the merchant captain had been trying to avoid customs duties on, including a chest of silver coins that makes the violence seem almost worthwhile when it's divided among the crew. But 3 pirates are dead, and 5 more are seriously wounded, including one man who'll likely lose his leg to gangrene. Thomas does the arithmetic in his head and realizes that his share of the prize, divided by the risk and trauma, doesn't seem like such a good bargain after all. In the weeks that follow, Thomas begins to notice the toll that this life takes on the men around him. There's the physical damage, of course. Missing limbs, scars, eyes lost to splinters or cutlass strokes, teeth knocked out or rotted away by scurvy. But there's psychological damage too, though no one has words for it yet. Men who wake screaming from nightmares about battles they survived. Men who can't stop their hands from shaking, who flinch at sudden noises, who drink themselves insensible trying to forget things they've seen and done. Men who've been at sea so long they've forgotten how to live any other way, who go ashore and immediately start fights because they no longer know how to interact with peaceful society. Thomas also comes to understand the isolation of pirate life. They cannot safely visit most ports, for their faces might be recognized, their ship identified. When they need supplies, they must rely on shady merchants willing to trade with outlaws, and these suppliers charge premium prices for the risk they take. When men are injured or sick, there's rarely access to proper medical care. They make do with the crude surgery of the ship's carpenter-turned-surgeon, who learned his craft by trial and error and who loses as many patients as he saves. And always, there's the threat of capture. Navies and colonial governments are increasingly organized in their pursuit of pirates. Pirate hunting vessels patrol the shipping lanes, and naval captains make their reputations by bringing pirates to trial. The punishment for piracy is death by hanging, and the authorities make these executions public spectacles meant to deter others from the pirate life. The bodies are sometimes displayed in iron cages at harbor entrances, left to rot as warnings to passing sailors. Thomas witnesses one of these executions when the crew sneaks into Port Royal in disguise to sell some of their prize goods. 6 pirates are being hanged that day, and the whole town has turned out to watch. The condemned men are brought out in chains, and Thomas is struck by how ordinary they look, young men, mostly, not much older than himself, thin and sick-looking from months in prison. They're given a chance to make final speeches, and some proclaim their innocence or beg for mercy, but one man uses his last words to warn the crowd that honest poverty drove him to piracy, that the real criminals are the merchants and ship owners who treat their workers worse than slaves. The hangings themselves are bungled, as public executions often are. The drop is too short, so the men don't die instantly from broken necks but instead strangle slowly, kicking and convulsing at the end of the rope while the crowd watches. It takes several minutes for each man to die, and Thomas forces himself to watch, feeling that he owes them that much, to bear witness, to remember that this could easily be his own fate. When it's finally over and the bodies are cut down, he returns to the ship shaken, unable to get the image of those dying men out of his mind. The months pass, marked by the rhythm of the sea and the irregular punctuation of prizes taken or opportunities missed. Thomas becomes competent in his role, learning to move through the rigging with the unconscious grace of an experienced sailor, to estimate ranges for cannon fire, to read the weather in the color of the sky and the feel of the wind. He makes friends among the crew. There's Samuel, a former Royal Navy deserter who can tell stories that make the whole crew laugh until they weep. There's Black Caesar, an escaped slave from Jamaica who stands 6.5 feet tall and whose strength is legendary even among these hard men. There's young William, barely 14 years old, who joined the crew after being abused on a merchant vessel and who Thomas finds himself protecting almost instinctively. But he also witnesses the casual cruelties that pirate life enables. When they take a slave ship off the coast of Africa, several of the pirates argue for freeing the enslaved Africans chained in the hold, but others see only potential profit. The argument becomes heated, nearly turning violent, until a compromise is reached. The Africans will be given the choice of joining the crew or being set ashore at the nearest land. Most choose land, understandably terrified of remaining with white men even if these particular white men claim to offer freedom. A few, including one man who speaks some English and says his name is Kwame, choose to join the crew, and Thomas watches as they adapt to pirate life with the pragmatic resilience of people who have already survived worse. The ship sails on, and Thomas begins to notice the slow degradation that affects every pirate vessel that stays at sea too long. The sails become patched and repatched until they're more repair than original cloth, weakened and prone to splitting in strong winds. The rigging grows frayed, and lengths of rope are spliced together until they're unreliable. The hull develops leaks that require constant pumping, and the carpenter shakes his head over rot that's spreading through timbers he can't easily replace. The ship needs a major refit, but that requires a friendly port with shipyard facilities, and such places are becoming scarce as colonial governments crack down on pirate havens. The food situation grows worse as well. They've been at sea for 3 months since their last proper reprovisioning, and the supplies are running low. The hardtack is so infested with weevils that every bite means eating insects. The salted meat has taken on a greenish tinge and smells faintly of rot even after soaking. The water in the casks is thick and slimy, with things growing in it that no one wants to examine too closely. Men are showing the first signs of scurvy, swollen gums, loose teeth, mysterious bruises. The captain knows they need to make port soon, but the nearest safe anchorage is weeks away. Then comes the storm. It builds slowly over the course of a day, starting with high clouds that Thomas has learned to recognize as a warning. The barometer drops, and the sea takes on an oily quality, with long swells that make the ship roll in a sickening corkscrew motion. By evening, the wind has risen to a howl, and the captain orders all sails struck except for a scrap of canvas to maintain steerage. The crew lashes down everything that can move, securing the cannon, battening the hatches, preparing for what they all know is coming. The storm hits at midnight with a fury that makes Thomas understand why sailors speak of the sea as a living thing, actively malicious. Rain falls so hard it's difficult to breathe, and waves break over the ship with such force that men must lash themselves to the mast or rigging to avoid being swept overboard. The ship climbs mountains of water and crashes down into troughs so deep that the wave tops seem higher than the masthead. Every timber groans with the strain, and the sound of wood creaking and splitting under the pressure is audible even over the roar of wind and water. Thomas spends that night in the worst terror he's ever known, clinging to the rigging with arms that shake with exhaustion, drenched to the skin, cold beyond anything he imagined possible, watching waves approach that seem certain to overwhelm the ship. Men are praying aloud in half a dozen languages, making bargains with God or gods they haven't thought about in years, promising to reform their lives if only they survive this night. The storm makes no distinction between pirate and honest sailor, showing them all how fragile their vessel is, how insignificant their human concerns are against the raw power of nature. The storm lasts 3 days. On the second day, a wave larger than all the others breaks over the bow with such violence that it tears away part of the forward rail and sweeps 2 men into the sea. Thomas sees one of them, Samuel, his friend who told such wonderful stories. Flailing in the water for just a moment before another wave buries him and he's gone, vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. There's no possibility of rescue, no chance of turning back in these conditions. The man is simply lost, and the ship sails on because it has no choice. When the storm finally breaks on the morning of the 4th day, the crew takes stock of their losses. 2 men drowned, as Thomas witnessed. 3 more are missing, presumably washed overboard during the night when no one was watching. 1 man has a broken leg from being thrown against the mast, the bone protruding through the skin in a compound fracture that will likely kill him even if the surgeon manages to amputate successfully. The ship has lost her foremast completely, torn away in the night, and the mainmast is cracked and will need to be replaced. Water has gotten into the hold despite the battened hatches, ruining much of their remaining food supplies. They're hundreds of miles off course, driven north by the storm, their ship crippled and their supplies exhausted. The surgeon does amputate the injured man's leg, working on the deck in full daylight because the space below is too dark for such delicate work. Thomas is one of 4 men chosen to hold the patient down, and he'll never forget the sound of the saw cutting through bone, or the screams that eventually weaken to whimpers and then to silence as the man passes out from shock and blood loss. The surgeon cauterizes the stump with a red-hot iron, and the smell of burning flesh joins all the other horrors of that day. The man lives through the surgery but dies 2 days later anyway, fever and infection overwhelming his weakened body. The ship limps toward the nearest land, which happens to be the coast of Carolina. They have no choice now, they must make port for repairs even if it means risking capture. The captain decides to try for one of the remote inlets that dot the Carolina coast, places where small communities have sprung up just far enough from colonial authority to be willing to trade with pirates if the price is right. They find such a place, a collection of rough houses and fishing shacks built around a natural harbor, and the locals are indeed willing to trade, at outrageous prices that eat up most of the crew's remaining money. But they get fresh food, clean water, timber for repairs, sailcloth, and rope. The carpenter and his mates worked on to dusk for 2 weeks, jury-rigging a new foremast from the best timber they can obtain, patching the hull, replacing worn rigging. It's not as good as a proper shipyard could do, but it's enough to make the vessel seaworthy again. During this time ashore, Thomas has long conversations with some of the locals, former pirates themselves, who took advantage of various amnesty offers to retire from the life. They tell him honestly what he's beginning to suspect himself, that piracy is a young man's game, that the odds of surviving more than a few years are vanishingly small. Disease, combat, storms, accidents, and eventually capture and execution claim almost everyone who takes up this life. The few who do survive usually do so by quitting while they're ahead, taking their earnings and disappearing into some remote community where their past isn't known or isn't questioned. One old man, his face weathered like ancient leather, his body bent by arthritis and old injuries, tells Thomas something he'll remember for the rest of his life. The sea keeps a tally, boy, and she always collects in the end. Every man what sails under the black flag is borrowing time, and the interest compounds daily. You think you're free, living outside the law, answering to no master, but you're more trapped than any man in chains. At least a slave might live to see old age. These words echo in Thomas's mind as the ship puts to sea again. The crew has been reduced by casualties to barely 40 men, and they're having trouble recruiting replacements. Word has spread about the storm and the losses they suffered, and sailors are superstitious about joining unlucky ships. The captain decides to sail south again, back toward the Caribbean where prizes are more plentiful and the warm waters are kinder than the North Atlantic. But the ship's luck seems to have run out permanently. They cruise for 6 weeks without taking a single prize. Every merchant vessel they encounter either outguns them or outsails them, or both. The crew grows increasingly desperate and fractious. There are arguments over trivial matters that nearly escalate to violence. The democratic system that held them together begins to break down as men fragment into factions, each blaming others for their misfortune. Then comes the day that changes everything. They spot what appears to be a fat merchant vessel, heavily loaded, sailing alone. The pirates give chase eagerly, sensing easy prey. But as they close, the merchant ship suddenly unveils cannon ports that had been concealed, and the British naval ensign runs up her mast. It's a trap, a pirate hunter disguised as a merchant vessel, and the pirates have sailed straight into it. The naval vessel has more guns, better trained crew, and the weight of law on her side. The pirate captain knows immediately that they cannot win a direct fight, and he orders the helmsman to come about, trying to flee. But the pirate ship is in poor condition, still not fully recovered from the storm damage, and the naval vessel is purpose-built for speed. Within 2 hours, the hunter has closed to cannon range and begins a systematic bombardment. Thomas experiences combat from the receiving end now, and it's far worse than fighting had been. At least in a boarding action, he could strike back, could feel like he had some control over his fate. But now he can only crouch behind the rail while cannonballs tear through the rigging, smash into the hull, send splinters flying like arrows. A ball passes so close to his head that he feels the wind of its passage, and when he looks up, the man who had been standing 3 feet away has been decapitated so cleanly that his body remains upright for a moment before collapsing. The pirate ship cannot escape and cannot fight. Surrender is the only option, but the captain hesitates, knowing that surrender means capture, trial, and almost certain hanging. Some of the crew are begging him to strike their colors, preferring to take their chances with British justice rather than die in this hopeless fight. Others are arguing that they should fight to the death, that at least they'll die free rather than at the end of a rope. The decision is taken out of everyone's hands when a lucky shot from the naval vessel hits the pirate ship's powder magazine. The explosion is instantaneous and catastrophic. Thomas is blown into the air by the blast, flies through space in a confusion of heat and noise and pain, and plunges into the water. When he surfaces, gasping and choking, he sees that the pirate ship has been blown nearly in half, already sinking rapidly. Debris rains down around him. Burning timber, torn sailcloth, pieces of things and people that his mind refuses to identify. Men are screaming in the water all around him, some burning from the explosion, others wounded, others simply struggling to stay afloat. Thomas grabs a piece of wreckage, a hatch cover, and clings to it, keeping his head above water. The naval vessel has lowered boats now, and sailors are pulling survivors from the water, though whether this rescue is merciful or simply delays the inevitable, Thomas doesn't know. He's hauled into one of the boats, water streaming from his clothes, coughing up seawater and blood. His left ear is ringing from the explosion, and he'll later learn that his hearing on that side is permanently damaged. His clothes are torn and burned, his skin covered in cuts and bruises, but by some miracle he seems to have no serious injuries. He looks back at the pirate ship, his home for the past year, as she makes her final plunge beneath the waves, taking most of his shipmates with her. Of a crew of 40, perhaps 15 have been pulled from the water alive. The survivors are brought aboard the naval vessel, clapped in irons, and locked in the hold. Thomas finds himself chained in darkness with a dozen other men, some wounded, all in shock, none speaking. They remain there for 2 weeks while the naval vessel completes her patrol, and those 2 weeks give Thomas plenty of time to contemplate his situation. He is, without question, a pirate. He has attacked merchant vessels, participated in boarding actions, shared in the division of stolen goods. Under British law, the penalty for piracy is death, and there will be no mercy for him. When the naval vessel finally makes port at Nassau in the Bahamas, prisoners are transferred to the local jail to await trial. The jail is a small stone building, sweltering in the tropical heat, designed to hold perhaps 6 prisoners but now packed with 15 pirates. They're given minimal food and water, just enough to keep them alive for trial. Some of the men have wounds that are turning septic, filling the cramped space with the smell of gangrene. One man dies in the night, and his body is left in the cell for 2 days before guards finally remove it. The trial, when it comes, is a formality rather than a genuine examination of justice. There is no question of innocence or guilt. The pirates were caught in the act of piracy, taken in arms aboard a pirate vessel. The only question is whether any of them qualify for mercy under some technicality of law. Thomas considers claiming that he was forced to join the pirates, that he had no choice, but he knows the captain and crew of his original merchant vessel are still alive and could testify that he volunteered. Such lies would only make his situation worse. The judge, a colonial official wearing his finest wig and robes despite the heat, delivers the expected sentence with barely concealed satisfaction. The prisoners are to be hanged by the neck until dead, and may God have mercy on their souls. The executions are scheduled for 3 days hence, giving the condemned men time to make their peace with God, and giving the colony time to advertise the event and ensure a good crowd for the spectacle. Those 3 days are the longest of Thomas's life. He's transferred to a condemned cell, slightly less crowded than the general holding area, where he and his fellow pirates await their deaths. Some of the men pray constantly, whispering desperate pleas to a God they've ignored for years. Others maintain a defiant silence, refusing to show fear. One man, young William, whom Thomas had tried to protect, weeps quietly day and night, and there's nothing Thomas can say to comfort him because they both know what's coming. A minister visits them, a thin, severe man who seems more interested in condemning their sins than offering genuine spiritual comfort. He tells them that their crimes are so heinous that they can barely hope for God's forgiveness, that they're likely bound for hell, that their deaths will at least serve as warnings to other potential pirates. His words offer no comfort, and several of the pirates eventually tell him to leave, that they'd rather face damnation in peace than listen to his cheerless certainty of their doom. On the morning of the execution, Thomas and his fellow condemned are led out in chains to the gallows that have been erected on the harbor front. A huge crowd has gathered. This is entertainment for the colonists, a break from the monotony of daily life, a chance to see justice done and mortality displayed in its most dramatic form. Thomas can see men and women from all levels of colonial society. Wealthy planters in their fine clothes, merchants and shopkeepers, servants and slaves, sailors from the ships in harbor, even children brought by their parents to learn a moral lesson about the wages of sin. The prisoners are made to stand on the gallows platform while the charges against them are read aloud, a recitation of their crimes that takes nearly an hour in the hot sun. Then the minister returns to offer one final prayer, asking God to receive these sinners' souls. Though his tone suggests he expects God will do no such thing. Finally, the prisoners are asked if they have any final words. Most remain silent, but one man, Black Caesar, who had joined them from the slave ship, speaks clearly in his deep voice. I was born free in my homeland, stolen and enslaved by white men, sold like cattle in this very port. I took up piracy because it was the only freedom offered to me. If I am damned for seeking liberty, then damn your laws and damn your justice. The crowd murmurs at this, some angry at his defiance, others perhaps troubled by the truth in his words. Thomas, when his turn comes, finds he has nothing eloquent to say. He simply tells the truth, I'm 20 years old. I wanted a better life than servitude offered. I made poor choices and hurt no one who didn't try to hurt me first. I'm sorry for causing pain to innocent people, and I hope my death will square the account. His voice shakes as he speaks, and he's not sure if anyone beyond the first row of spectators can even hear him. Then the hoods are placed over the prisoners' heads, and the world goes dark. Thomas can hear his own breathing, rapid and panicked, can hear the breathing of the men beside him, can hear the crowd's anticipatory silence. The rope is rough against his neck, positioned with practiced care by the hangman who's done this hundreds of times. Thomas's legs are trembling so badly he can barely stand, and he's distantly ashamed to realize he's weeping beneath the hood, tears streaming down his face, his breath coming in gasps. He hears the minister intoning a final prayer but can't make out the words over the pounding of blood in his ears. He thinks of his mother, whom he hasn't seen in 2 years, who probably believes he's dead already or wishes he was. He thinks of the sea, which has been his home and his prison, his fortune and his doom. He thinks. But here we must pause in Thomas's story, for while his fate seems certain, hanging was not always the end of a pirate's tale. Sometimes, though rarely, fortune intervened in unexpected ways. In Thomas's case, his youth and his final words would move someone in the crowd. A wealthy merchant who had once been a sailor himself, who remembered the desperation of poverty, who saw in this young man a reflection of what he himself might have become with slightly different choices. This merchant approaches the governor that very evening and makes a proposal. Several of the condemned pirates are young men, first-time offenders, who might yet be reformed. What if, instead of hanging them, they were pressed into service on a merchant vessel bound for the dangerous waters off Madagascar? It would be a death sentence of a different kind. Most men sent to those waters didn't return, but it would give them a chance, however slim, of redemption. The merchant would sponsor this commutation personally, taking responsibility for the men's behavior. The governor, who had already overseen enough executions that day to satisfy public appetite for justice, agrees to this proposal. The next morning, Thomas and 3 other young pirates are informed that their sentences have been commuted to forced service. They're to spend 7 years on merchant vessels, with no pay beyond their keep, essentially as floating prisoners. If they survive those 7 years and their service is satisfactory, they'll be free men. If they attempt escape or mutiny, they'll be hanged immediately without trial. Thomas accepts this reprieve with numb gratitude. He has just enough self-awareness to recognize it as a stay of execution rather than true mercy. The odds of surviving 7 years on merchant vessels in the Indian Ocean are probably not much better than the odds of surviving on the gallows. But it's a chance, which is more than he had yesterday, and he's still young enough to hope. The merchant vessel he's assigned to is bound for India and Madagascar, carrying trade goods and returning with spices, tea, and cloth. The conditions are exactly as brutal as he remembers from his first voyage, before piracy offered him that brief illusion of better treatment. He's back to cramped quarters, inadequate food, casual cruelty from the officers, backbreaking labor for no reward beyond survival. But now he has no escape route, no possibility of joining a pirate crew if the conditions become unbearable. He must endure, or die in the attempt. The voyage takes months, sailing around the Cape of Good Hope where storms are even worse than those Thomas experienced in the Caribbean. He watches men die of disease, accident, and simple exhaustion. He sees officers order floggings for trivial offenses, creating fresh scars on backs already covered with old ones. He endures heat that makes the hold feel like an oven, and cold that leaves frost on the rigging. He learns what it means to be truly powerless, to have no rights whatsoever, to exist at the absolute mercy of men who view him as less than human. But Thomas also discovers reserves of endurance he didn't know he possessed. Perhaps his year as a pirate, for all its horrors, taught him something about survival. He learns to make himself invisible to the officers, to do his work competently enough to avoid punishment but not so well that he attracts attention. He learns to guard his meager possessions carefully, to eat food that would make a dog hesitate, to sleep in conditions that would break a weaker man. He survives his first year, then his second, then his third. During those years, he sees things that will haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. He watches as enslaved Africans are loaded aboard in Madagascar, chained in the hold in conditions that make the crew's quarters look luxurious. He hears their weeping in the night, the sound drifting up through the deck planking, and knows that his suffering, real as it is nothing compared to theirs. When several of the enslaved people die during the voyage, of disease, despair, or the brutal conditions, their bodies are simply thrown overboard, with no more ceremony than one might dispose of spoiled cargo. He sees the merchant captain sell weapons to warring kingdoms in India, knowing those weapons will be used to kill thousands, all to turn a profit. He sees the casual racism with which Europeans treat the people whose lands they're exploiting, the assumption that white skin confers not just advantage but actual superiority, that taking wealth from other nations is not theft but commerce. He comes to understand that the piracy he participated in, though illegal and violent, was in some ways more honest than the legal trade that enables it. Both are founded on theft and violence, but at least pirates don't pretend otherwise. In his fourth year of service, Thomas's ship is caught in a typhoon off the coast of Sumatra. The storm is even worse than the one he survived as a pirate, and this time there's no question of the ship surviving. She breaks apart in mountainous seas, her timbers shattering like kindling, and Thomas finds himself once again in the water, clinging to wreckage, surrounded by drowning men. This time, however, he manages to reach shore, washing up on a beach alongside 3 other survivors. They're in a foreign land, speaking no local language, with no money and no way to reach civilization. For weeks they stumble through the jungle, eating whatever they can find, drinking from streams, hiding from local inhabitants they fear might be hostile. 2 of the men die, one from a snake bite, another from a fever. Thomas and the remaining survivor finally reach a port town where they're taken in by a community of mixed-race traders who operate on the margins of the colonial economy. Thomas spends 2 years in this place, and they might be the best years of his life since childhood. He works as a general laborer, loading and unloading ships, helping with construction, doing whatever tasks need doing. He's paid fairly, treated decently, slowly regaining the sense of being a human being rather than a beast of burden. He learns some of the local language, makes friends, begins to believe that maybe, somehow, he might survive to old age after all. But the colonial authorities eventually catch up with him. His name appears on a list of men who were supposed to be serving out sentences on merchant vessels, and when naval officers arrive searching for deserters and escaped convicts, Thomas is identified and arrested. The fact that his ship was destroyed in a storm doesn't matter. He was supposed to complete 7 years of service, and he's completed less than 5. The remaining time must be served. So Thomas finds himself once again aboard a merchant vessel, once again reduced to the status of forced laborer, once again subject to the absolute authority of officers who have every reason to make his life miserable. The captain of this vessel has been informed that Thomas is a former pirate serving a commuted death sentence, and he takes every opportunity to remind Thomas of this fact, treating him more harshly than any other member of the crew. The final 3 years are the hardest Thomas has endured. He's no longer young, he's approaching 30 now, considered old for a common sailor, and his body bears the accumulated damage of years at sea. His hands are gnarled with arthritis from constant work with wet rope, his hearing is poor from years of cannon fire and shouted orders, his teeth are loosened by scurvy, his back is scarred from floggings, his joints ache in damp weather from old injuries poorly healed. He looks like a man of 50, worn down by hardship and suffering. But he endures. Day after day, month after month, year after year, he endures. And finally, incredibly, his 7 years are complete. In a port in Carolina, not far, ironically, from where his pirate ship was destroyed, Thomas is given a document certifying that he has completed his sentence. He is, the paper declares, a free man, his debt to society paid. He is to receive no back wages for his 7 years of forced labor, no compensation for his suffering, just this piece of paper and permission to go ashore. Thomas stands on the dock with his document and the clothes on his back, literally everything he owns in the world. He is 30 years old, looks 50, has no money, no trade beyond seamanship, no contacts, no prospects. He has survived when most men in his situation would have died, but survival has cost him almost everything that makes life worth living. His health is ruined, his youth is gone, he has no family or friends, he can barely read or write, he has no skills that will earn him a decent living ashore. He finds work where he can, day labor at the docks, brief employment on fishing boats, occasional jobs with merchant vessels that are desperate enough for crew to overlook his past. He lives in the poorest quarters of the port town, in rooms shared with other broken men, eating minimal food, drinking cheap rum to dull the constant pain in his joints and the worst pain of his memories. He knows he should consider himself lucky to be alive, but most days he doesn't feel lucky at all. Years pass. Thomas fades into the anonymous mass of poor men who labor in port cities, invisible to the wealthy merchants and ship captains who occasionally walk past him without seeing him. He never marries, never has children, never accumulates any property beyond a few clothes and a worn sea chest. He tells no one about his year as a pirate, that life seems like a dream now, or a nightmare, something that happened to a different person in a different world. One day, when Thomas is perhaps 45 years old, he's working on the docks when he sees a group of men being led in chains toward the gallows. More pirates, caught and condemned. The crowd is already gathering for the execution, and Thomas finds himself drawn to watch, though he's not sure why. Perhaps he needs to see how his own story might have ended, or perhaps he's seeking some connection to the young man he was, before all the suffering wore him down to this husk. He watches as the condemned men are brought to the scaffold, and he recognizes something in their faces. That mixture of defiance and terror, bravado and despair, that he remembers feeling himself a lifetime ago. He listens as they're offered a chance to speak, and one young man, barely 20, speaks words that could have come from Thomas's own mouth all those years ago, words about poverty and desperation, about seeking freedom and finding only a different kind of prison, about regretting harm caused but not regretting the attempt to escape servitude. The executions proceed, and Thomas watches as he watched before, but this time from the other side of the rope. He sees the men die, their bodies twitching and jerking, and he thinks about all the deaths he's witnessed in his life, comrades lost to storms and battle, enslaved people dying in holds, merchant sailors worked to death, men hanged for piracy. So much death, so much suffering, and for what? What has any of it accomplished beyond enriching a small number of already wealthy men and filling graveyards with the bodies of the poor? Thomas walks away from the execution scene feeling unutterably weary. He returns to his miserable room, lies down on his thin mattress, and stares at the ceiling. His chest hurts. It's been hurting for weeks now, a tightness that makes it hard to breathe sometimes. He knows what this probably means. He's seen enough men die of failing hearts to recognize the symptoms. He doesn't have long left, a few months perhaps, maybe less. And what has his life amounted to? He survived, yes, but survival alone is not much of an achievement. He's harmed people, stolen from them, participated in violence. He's also been harmed, stolen from, victimized by violence. He's been both perpetrator and victim, and he can't honestly say he was more one than the other. He's just another man ground up by a system that treats most people as disposable, as tools to be used until they break and then discarded. But perhaps, Thomas thinks, there's some value in simply bearing witness. He survived to tell the story, even if he's never told it to anyone, even if it exists only in his own memory. He knows the truth about piracy, about merchant service, about life at sea in this era. He knows that the stories people tell about noble naval battles and romantic pirates are lies. He knows that the real story is one of suffering and exploitation, of men driven to desperate choices by poverty and cruelty, of a system that treats human beings as cargo. Thomas dies 3 months later, alone in his room, probably of heart failure, though no one examines him to be sure. His body is discovered 2 days after his death, and since he has no family and no money, he's buried in a pauper's grave, in an unmarked plot shared with dozens of other forgotten men. No one mourns him. No one remembers his name. The historical record contains no trace that he ever existed. But his story, the story we've followed through these many pages, is the real story of piracy, the story behind the romance and the legend. Thomas's experience was repeated thousands of times in the Age of Sail, with minor variations but always the same essential pattern: desperate men driven to piracy by poverty and abuse, finding that the pirate life offers no real escape but only different hardships, dying young if they're unlucky or surviving to become broken old men if they are lucky. This was the reality, and it was horrible in ways that adventure stories never capture. Let's step back now from Thomas's specific story and look at the broader reality of pirate life, examining the aspects of that existence that made it so difficult to survive. We followed Thomas's journey, but his experiences illuminate universal truths about piracy in this era. The physical conditions aboard pirate vessels were, to be blunt, appalling by any standard. The ships themselves were usually captured merchant vessels, which meant they were designed for cargo rather than crew comfort. Pirates might capture a ship that normally carried a crew of 30 men and sail it with 70 or 80, packing twice as many bodies into spaces that were inadequate to begin with. The overcrowding meant that disease spread rapidly, that privacy was non-existent, that the already foul air below decks became almost unbreathable. The smell alone would be enough to make a modern person retch. Imagine 70 unwashed bodies in a confined space, men who might go months between baths, whose clothes are never truly cleaned, who have no deodorant or any concept of personal hygiene as we understand it. Add to this the smell of the bilge water sloshing beneath the floorboards, which was a mixture of seawater, vomit, urine, food waste, and general filth. Add the smell of the livestock that ships carried for fresh food. Chickens, pigs, sometimes goats, kept in pens on deck where their waste added to the general foulness. Add the smell of the cargo, whatever it might be: salted fish, animal hides, barrels of tar, bales of tobacco. The constant dampness made everything worse. Below decks was always humid, always dripping with condensation, and nothing ever truly dried out. Clothes were perpetually damp, bedding was perpetually moist, wood was perpetually swollen with moisture that encouraged rot and mold. Men developed skin conditions from the constant dampness, fungal infections, sores that wouldn't heal, painful rashes. Their feet, rarely dry, would develop conditions that today we call trench foot or immersion foot, the flesh becoming white and soft, then developing painful sores, sometimes becoming infected in ways that led to amputation or death. The diet, as we've touched on, was barely adequate at the best of times and often fell below that standard. Scurvy was the most dramatic deficiency disease, but pirates also suffered from beriberi, from lack of thiamine, pellagra, from lack of niacin, and general malnutrition that left them vulnerable to every disease and infection. The common ration was supposed to provide about 2,500 calories per day, but the actual nutritional value of months-old hardtack, salt meat that was more salt than meat, and worm-infested beans was far below what the nominal calorie count suggested. Fresh food was a rare luxury. When pirates put into isolated anchorages, hunting and fishing supplemented their diet significantly, and men would gorge themselves on fresh meat and fish, knowing it might be weeks or months before they tasted such food again. Some pirates attempted to keep gardens on board, growing herbs or vegetables in boxes on deck, but the salt spray and lack of fresh water made this difficult. The result was that most pirates lived in a state of chronic malnutrition, their bodies slowly consuming themselves for lack of proper nutrition. Water was another constant problem. The wooden casks in which water was stored quickly developed algae growth, turning the water green and slimy and giving it a foul taste. After a few weeks, the water would be so bad that men would drink it only after mixing it with rum to mask the flavor. This led to chronic dehydration, as men chose to drink less rather than endure the foul-tasting water. Dehydration exacerbated every other health problem, from constipation to kidney stones to heightened susceptibility to heat stroke in tropical waters. The work itself was dangerous in ways that modern people can barely imagine. Climbing the rigging in calm weather was risky enough. A fall from the main yard, perhaps 60 feet above the deck, was almost certainly fatal. But pirates had to work the rigging in storms, in darkness, with the ship rolling wildly, rain making every surface slippery, wind trying to tear them loose from their handholds. Men fell regularly, and those falls were nearly always deadly. The lucky ones died on impact when they hit the deck. The unlucky ones fell into the sea and were lost, either drowning immediately or surviving just long enough to watch their ship sail on without them, unable to turn back in heavy weather. The cannon work was equally hazardous. These were not precision instruments but crude iron tubes that could explode without warning if they were overloaded or if a flaw in the metal gave way under the stress of firing. When a cannon exploded, it sent shrapnel in all directions, killing or maiming everyone nearby. Even when the guns functioned properly, they were dangerous. The recoil could crush a man against the opposite rail if he didn't move fast enough, and the heavy iron balls being loaded could roll with the ship's motion and crush feet or legs. Splinters were one of the most common causes of injury in naval combat, and they were far more deadly than the word suggests. When a cannonball struck a wooden ship, it sent foot-long splinters of hardwood flying like spears in all directions. These splinters could impale a man completely, pierce vital organs, or cause wounds that were almost impossible to treat. Even minor splinter wounds often became infected, and infection in this era before antibiotics frequently meant death. The medical care available to injured or sick pirates was primitive to the point of being medieval. Most pirate ships carried no trained physician, doctors could make good livings ashore and had no incentive to risk their lives at sea. Instead, the ship's carpenter usually served as surgeon, using the same tools for cutting flesh that he used for cutting wood. His medical knowledge came from experience and observation rather than any formal training, and his treatments were based more on tradition than on scientific understanding. Surgery was performed without anesthesia beyond rum or opium if the ship was lucky enough to have any. Men being amputated were held down by 4 or 5 strong sailors while the surgeon sawed through bone and flesh, the patient's screams audible throughout the ship. The survival rate for major surgery was perhaps 50% at best, and survivors often died later from infection or shock. The surgeon's tools were rarely cleaned properly, and the concept of sterilization didn't exist yet, so cross-contamination between patients was common. Even minor injuries could become life-threatening. A small cut, the kind we'd treat with a bandage and think nothing of, could become infected and develop into gangrene. Once gangrene set in, spreading up the limb and turning the flesh black and necrotic, the only treatment was amputation, cutting off the affected limb above the infected area and hoping the gangrene hadn't spread too far into the body. Men watched in horror as their flesh literally rotted while they were still alive, the smell of decay preceding them wherever they went, knowing that they would soon be faced with the choice between amputation and death. The psychological toll of pirate life was perhaps even worse than the physical hardships, though it's less well documented. These were men living in constant awareness that they could be killed at any moment. By storm, by disease, by combat, by accident, or by execution if captured. They had no security, no savings to fall back on, no family to support them if they were injured, no future beyond the next prize or the next disaster. This chronic stress manifested in various ways. Many pirates turned to alcohol as their primary coping mechanism. Rum was available in quantities that would shock modern observers, and men drank not for pleasure but to numb themselves to their circumstances. It was not uncommon for pirates to drink themselves unconscious on a regular basis, and alcohol-related accidents, men falling overboard while drunk, falling from the rigging, or simply drinking so much they didn't wake up the next morning, were common causes of death. Violence was another outlet for stress and frustration. While pirate ships had rules against crew members fighting each other, enforcement was inconsistent, and brawls were frequent. Men who had been living in close quarters for months, who were tired and scared and frustrated, would erupt into violence over the smallest perceived slight. These fights could be brutal, with men beating each other savagely, biting, gouging eyes, using whatever weapons came to hand. The officers might break up such fights, or they might let them continue until one participant was too injured to continue, reasoning that allowing controlled violence was better than having tension build until it exploded in mutiny. Sexual frustration was another constant stressor. Pirate ships officially prohibited women aboard, though this rule was sometimes ignored when female prisoners or wives of crew members were present. In the absence of women, sexual relationships between crew members existed in a murky zone, officially forbidden but quietly tolerated as long as they remained discreet and didn't disrupt ship operations. Some historians have documented what they carefully term particular friendships between pirates, relationships that provided emotional support and physical intimacy in an otherwise brutal existence. The isolation was profound in ways that are difficult for modern people to comprehend. Pirates might go months without seeing anyone outside their immediate crew, and even when they made port, they had to be cautious about revealing their identity. They couldn't write letters home, mail service was unreliable at best, and sending letters would create evidence of their location that authorities could use to track them. They couldn't return to their home ports or visit their families without risking arrest. They existed in a kind of permanent exile, cut off from the society they'd been born into but unable to establish a legitimate place in any new society. The constant vigilance required was mentally exhausting. Pirates always had to be watching for threats, naval vessels that might be hunting them, merchant ships that might be disguised warships, other pirate crews that might attack them for their prizes, informants who might betray them to authorities for reward money. They had to be careful about whom they trusted, what they said, where they went. Paranoia was not mental illness but rational adaptation to genuine danger, and it made genuine friendship or trust extremely difficult. The nightmares were common, though rarely documented. Men who had seen combat, who had killed or watched others die violently, who had been through storms that seemed certain to kill them, would wake screaming in the night, disturbing the entire crew with their distress. Some men developed what we'd now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, hypervigilance, flashbacks, emotional numbness, inability to feel pleasure or connection. But in that era, such men were simply considered weak or strange, and they received no treatment or support beyond mockery from their less affected shipmates. The financial reality of piracy was also far less glamorous than legends suggest. While it's true that successful pirates could accumulate substantial sums from rich prizes, several factors limited how much wealth they actually retained. First, prizes were unpredictable. A crew might go months without taking anything valuable, surviving on meager rations and growing increasingly desperate. When they did take a prize, the cargo might be bulky goods that were difficult to sell, timber, grain, cloth, rather than easily portable valuables. Second, even when pirates took valuable cargo, selling it was challenging. Legitimate merchants wouldn't deal with known pirates, so pirates had to rely on a network of corrupt officials and criminal middlemen who bought stolen goods at a fraction of their value. A cargo that might fetch £1,000 at a legitimate market might bring only £200 or £300 from a fence, and the pirates had to accept whatever price they were offered because they had no other options. Third, the division of prize money meant that individual shares were often quite modest. A crew of 70 men taking a prize worth £300 would see each man receive about £4 after the captain and officers received their extra shares. £4 was decent money, equivalent to perhaps 2 or 3 months' wages for an ordinary laborer, but hardly the fortune of legend, and it had to last through whatever period of unsuccessful cruising came next. Fourth, pirates had no way to save or invest their money safely. They couldn't put it in banks without creating records that authorities could trace. They couldn't invest in legitimate businesses or property without revealing their identities. So they carried their wealth with them in the form of coins or portable goods, which could be lost in shipwrecks, stolen by other pirates, or simply spent on the expensive rum and food available at the isolated anchorages where pirates traded. The result was that most pirates lived in a boom-and-bust cycle, briefly rich after a successful prize, spending their money quickly on immediate needs and wants, then returning to poverty during long stretches without prizes. The handful of pirates who did accumulate substantial wealth usually did so by being exceptionally lucky, exceptionally ruthless, or by retiring from piracy early and investing their earnings in legitimate enterprises, which required connections and knowledge that most pirates lacked. The legal situation made everything worse. Pirates were hostes humani generis, enemies of all mankind, under international law, which meant that any nation could try and execute them regardless of where their crimes had been committed. This universal jurisdiction made pirates perpetual fugitives with no safe harbor. Even nations that had previously tolerated piracy for their own purposes, issuing letters of marque during wartime, for example, would crack down on pirates when peace returned or when international pressure demanded it. The trials themselves were generally perfunctory. Pirates caught in the act had no real defense, and courts showed little interest in examining the circumstances that had led men to piracy. The judges and juries were usually drawn from the merchant and planter classes whose property pirates threatened, so sympathy was scarce. Conviction rates were very high, and the standard sentence was death by hanging. The executions were designed to be public spectacles that would deter others from piracy. Pirates were hanged at low tide, and their bodies were left in gibbets, iron cages, placed at harbor entrances where incoming ships would see them. The bodies would remain there for years, slowly decomposing, being picked apart by birds, bleaching in the sun, serving as grim reminders of the wages of piracy. Some of these gibbeted corpses became famous, with sailors recognizing particular pirates by the distinctive cages that held their remains. For pirates who weren't caught and executed, the alternative fates were rarely much better. Many died at sea, in storms, in battles, from disease or accident. Their deaths were anonymous and unmarked, their bodies either buried at sea or left to rot wherever they happened to fall. No one maintained records of these deaths, no one mourned them, they simply disappeared as if they'd never existed. Those who survived long enough to retire from piracy faced the difficult challenge of reintegrating into legitimate society. A few managed it successfully, taking advantage of occasional amnesty offers to surrender and receive pardons, then using their accumulated wealth to establish themselves as merchants or planters. But most found that their reputations followed them, that legitimate society was unwilling to accept former pirates regardless of any official pardon. They often ended up in frontier communities or isolated ports, places where questions about one's past were considered impolite and where former criminals could sometimes make fresh starts. The women associated with piracy deserve mention as well, though their stories are less well documented than those of male pirates. Some women did serve aboard pirate ships, disguised as men, the most famous being Anne Bonny and Mary Read, who sailed with Calico Jack Rackham in the early 18th century. These women faced all the hardships that male pirates endured, with the additional complication of having to conceal their gender in extremely close quarters. Other women were involved in piracy more indirectly, as wives, lovers, or business partners of pirates, managing the shoreside aspects of the operation. They might act as fences for stolen goods, provide safe houses where pirates could hide, launder money through legitimate businesses, or carry messages between crew members and their contacts ashore. These women were taking significant risks. If caught, they could be charged as accessories to piracy, but they often had few other options for economic survival. Still other women were victims of piracy, captured when pirates took merchant vessels or raided coastal communities. The treatment of female captives varied widely. Some pirates had articles forbidding sexual violence, and captive women might be treated as valuable prizes to be ransomed or sold. But other pirates showed no such restraint, and rape was a common occurrence when women were captured. The historical record is ambiguous on this point, with some accounts suggesting pirates were relatively restrained compared to other armed groups of the era, while other accounts describe brutal sexual violence. The interaction between pirates and the enslaved people they encountered was similarly complex. Many pirate crews included escaped slaves, who had fled to piracy as the only alternative to bondage. These black pirates often faced racism even within pirate crews, though the egalitarian structure of pirate society meant they had more rights than they would have had in colonial society. Some became respected members of their crews, even rising to positions of authority. Pirates also encountered enslaved people when they captured slave ships, and their response varied. Some pirate crews would free enslaved Africans and invite them to join the crew, seeing them as potential recruits. Others would sell the enslaved people at the next port, treating them as just another form of cargo. Still others would release them on the nearest coast, giving them a chance at freedom without requiring them to join a pirate crew. The deciding factor was usually practical rather than moral. Did the pirates need more crew members? Did they need money more than they needed crew, or were the enslaved people more trouble to keep than they were worth? This complexity reminds us that pirates were not noble rebels fighting against injustice, but rather men, and occasionally women, who had been failed by legal society and who created their own society with its own rules and norms. That society was more egalitarian than the legal world in some ways, more democratic, more fair in the distribution of wealth, less tolerant of arbitrary authority. But it was also more violent, more unstable, and ultimately unsustainable. The pirate Golden Age, roughly from 1650 to 1730, came to an end not because pirates were all killed or captured, but because the economic and political conditions that had enabled piracy changed. European nations made concerted efforts to suppress piracy, sending naval squadrons specifically to hunt pirates. Colonial governments cracked down on the corrupt officials and merchants who had been buying stolen goods, cutting off pirates' markets. The Royal Navy grew larger and more professional, and merchant vessels began sailing in convoys protected by warships, making them much harder targets. Most importantly, the employment situation for sailors slowly improved. The brutal conditions that had driven men to piracy as a better alternative began to moderate, not out of humanitarian concern but because chronic labor shortages meant that ship owners had to offer better conditions to recruit and retain crew. Pay increased slightly, rations improved marginally, the most extreme forms of punishment became less common. Legal seafaring was still hard, dangerous, poorly paid work, but it became just barely tolerable enough that piracy lost much of its appeal. As piracy declined, it began its transformation into legend. The actual pirates, desperate, malnourished, disease-ridden men living in squalor and fear, were gradually replaced in popular imagination by romantic figures of freedom and adventure. Books and plays portrayed pirates as dashing rogues rather than brutal criminals. The harsh reality of their lives was softened and eventually forgotten, replaced by stories that bore little resemblance to truth. This romanticization served several purposes. It allowed people to fantasize about escaping the constraints of civilized society without confronting the reality of what that escape would actually entail. It transformed a social problem, poverty and exploitation driving men to crime, into individual moral failure or adventurous spirit. It erased the victims of piracy, both the merchant sailors attacked by pirates and the pirates themselves victimized by the economic system that created piracy. Modern portrayals of piracy have continued and amplified this romanticization. Films and novels present piracy as exciting adventure, with dashing heroes who are really good men forced into outlawry by unjust circumstances, who fight with honor and treat their captives well, who find love and treasure and live happily ever after. These stories are entertaining, and there's nothing wrong with entertainment, but they bear no resemblance to the historical reality we've been exploring. The real pirates lived short, brutal lives in conditions that would horrify anyone who actually experienced them. They were not free men but fugitives, always running, always afraid, existing in a kind of limbo outside society. They were not wealthy adventurers but poor men who rarely accumulated much and who usually died destitute. They were not noble rebels but criminals, though the society they rebelled against was itself deeply unjust. Understanding the reality of pirate life helps us understand broader patterns in history. Piracy flourished when legal society failed to provide even basic opportunities for common people to survive with dignity. It declined not because authorities successfully suppressed it through violence, but because conditions for ordinary sailors improved just enough to make piracy unappealing. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout history. Crime flourishes where legitimate opportunity is lacking, and declines when alternatives become available. The pirate story also illustrates how narratives get constructed and reconstructed to serve the needs of later generations. The transformation of pirates from desperate criminals into romantic heroes says more about our own desires and anxieties than it does about historical pirates. We want to believe that freedom is possible, that we can escape the constraints of civilization, that adventure and treasure await those brave enough to seize them. The reality that such freedom comes with tremendous costs, that escape from one set of constraints often means accepting different and sometimes worse constraints, is less appealing, so we forget it. If we could somehow bring a real pirate from the early 18th century forward to our time and show him the way his life has been portrayed in popular culture, he would probably be baffled. The romantic pirate of fiction bears so little resemblance to his actual experience that he might not even recognize himself in the stories. The comfortable beds, the abundant food, the lack of disease and injury, the successful romances, the treasure that's actually kept and enjoyed rather than quickly spent on rum and basic supplies, all of this would seem like fantasy to someone who actually lived the pirate life. And if we explain to this time-traveling pirate that millions of people voluntarily watch films and read books about piracy for entertainment, that parents dress their children as pirates for Halloween, that pirate-themed parties are considered fun, he would probably think we were insane. Entertainment. Fun. About a life of constant fear, chronic hunger, recurring disease, and likely early death. About watching your friends die in storms and battles, about living as a fugitive with no home and no future, about knowing that capture means public execution. What possible entertainment value could such an existence have? But perhaps our pirate would understand, eventually, if we explained that these stories aren't really about his life at all. They're about our fantasies of freedom, our desire to escape from the constraints and obligations of modern life, our attraction to the idea of living by our own rules. The actual conditions of his existence are conveniently ignored because they would interfere with the fantasy. We want the romance without the reality, the freedom without the price, the adventure without the suffering. This is, in its way, a form of disrespect to the actual historical pirates and the brutally hard lives they lived. By transforming them into fantasy figures, we erase their reality and the lessons that reality might teach us. We lose the opportunity to understand how economic injustice creates crime, how brutal conditions drive people to desperate choices, how romanticizing criminal life can obscure its genuine horrors. So let us return, in these final reflections, to the core truth we've been exploring: you would not have wanted to be a pirate. Not really. Not if you understood what it actually meant. The freedom was illusory, the treasure was mostly imaginary, the adventure was miserable, and the likely outcomes were death, crippling injury, or execution. The few who survived emerged broken and traumatized, their youth consumed by a life that gave them nothing but suffering in return. Thomas, our hypothetical guide through this history, represents thousands of real men whose names are lost to history but whose experiences were essentially what we've described. They were not wicked people who deserved their suffering, nor were they noble heroes whose rebellion was justified by the injustice they faced. They were simply people, trying to survive in a world that offered them very few good choices, who made the best decisions they could with the information and options available to them, and who paid a terrible price for those decisions. If there's a lesson in their stories, it's perhaps this: that romanticizing the past serves no one well. The pirate era was not a time of adventure and freedom but of suffering and exploitation. The pirates themselves were victims of an unjust economic system, even as they became victimizers in their turn. The conditions that created piracy, poverty, exploitation, lack of opportunity, still exist in various forms today, and they still drive people to desperate choices. By understanding the reality of piracy rather than its romanticized version, we might gain insight into modern forms of crime and desperation. We might also develop more compassion for people who make choices we find morally troubling. It's easy to condemn pirates as criminals who deserve their punishment. It's harder but more honest to recognize them as people trapped by circumstances, making difficult choices in impossible situations, trying to find some path to survival or dignity in a world that offered them neither. This doesn't excuse their crimes or minimize the suffering they inflicted on others, but it does help us understand them as humans rather than as cartoon villains. And so we leave the pirate era behind, with its storm-tossed ships and desperate men, its brief moments of triumph and long stretches of suffering, its promises of freedom that turned out to be lies, its treasure that mostly existed in stories rather than reality. We leave behind Thomas and the thousands like him, men whose names are forgotten but whose lives testify to the human cost of economic injustice and romanticized criminality. The ocean still stretches endlessly in every direction, just as it did in the age of pirates. Ships still cross it, though now they're powered by engines rather than wind, guided by GPS rather than dead reckoning, staffed by sailors who work under labor laws and safety regulations that pirates could never have imagined. The romance of the sea persists in our culture, but the brutal reality that created piracy has receded, at least in the wealthy nations of the world. Yet elsewhere, in waters off Somalia or in the Strait of Malacca, modern piracy still exists, driven by the same desperation and lack of legitimate opportunity that created historical piracy. These modern pirates use motorboats and assault rifles instead of sailing ships and cutlasses, but the underlying dynamic is the same. Poor men in failed states turning to crime because they see no better option. And just like historical pirates, they're generally caught between violence and poverty, victimized by larger forces even as they victimize others. The story continues, in other words, though the setting has changed. As long as severe inequality exists, as long as some people are denied basic opportunities for survival and dignity, there will be those who turn to crime in desperation. Understanding this doesn't require us to excuse criminal behavior, but it might inspire us to address the root causes rather than simply punishing the symptoms. As we close this long exploration of the pirate life, let's remember the human beings behind the legend. Remember Thomas, dying alone in a rented room, his body worn out decades before its time, his life a testament to survival rather than triumph. Remember the men who drowned in storms, died of disease, were killed in battle, or hanged at the end of ropes. Remember the women who loved them, suffered with them, or fell victim to them. Remember the merchant sailors attacked by pirates, the enslaved people caught up in the pirate trade, the innocent people harmed by men who were themselves victims of an unjust system. Their stories are not comfortable, not uplifting, not the stuff of cheerful entertainment. But they're true, or at least as true as we can reconstruct from fragmentary historical records. And truth, however uncomfortable, has value that fantasy cannot match. It connects us to our shared human past, helps us understand the present, and might even guide us toward a better future. The life of a pirate was horrible. You would not have survived it, and if somehow you had survived, you would have been diminished by the experience, left with scars both physical and psychological that would never fully heal. This is the reality behind the legend, the truth beneath the romance. It's a truth worth remembering, even though, perhaps especially because, it's so much less pleasant than the stories we prefer to tell. And so, dear friend, we come to the end of our journey through this particular corner of history. The night has deepened around us, and these stories of suffering and survival have run their course. You've stayed with me through thousands of words, through tales of hardship and violence, through the unvarnished reality of lives lived at the margins of civilization. I'm grateful for your patience, for your willingness to look unflinchingly at a past that was far less romantic than legend suggests. If these stories have troubled your rest, that was not my intention, though perhaps it was inevitable. The truth about piracy is troubling, as truth often is. But there's value in understanding that the romanticized adventures we see in films and books bear little resemblance to the actual experiences of historical pirates. There's wisdom in recognizing that freedom, purchased at the price of perpetual fear and suffering, is not really freedom at all. There's compassion to be found in seeing pirates not as cartoon villains but as human beings trapped by circumstances, making difficult choices in impossible situations. Sleep now, if you can, and let these stories settle into the place where history lives in memory, not forgotten, but not actively troubling either. Let them inform your understanding of the past without disturbing your peace in the present. And perhaps, when you encounter romanticized portrayals of piracy in the future, you'll remember the reality we've explored together, and you'll see beyond the surface to the harder truths beneath. The ocean still rolls endlessly, as it always has and always will. The ships that once carried pirates have long since rotted away, but the water they sailed remains, indifferent to human stories of triumph and tragedy. And in that indifference there's a kind of peace. The recognition that our struggles, however intense they feel in the moment, are temporary, that the great forces of nature continue regardless of human drama, that time softens even the sharpest memories until they become simply stories we tell ourselves about who we were and who we might have been. Rest well, friend. The past is past, its sufferings ended, its participants long since gone to whatever lies beyond this life. We've borne witness to their stories, honored their memory by refusing to romanticize their suffering, and now we can release them back into history's embrace. Tomorrow will bring its own concerns, its own choices, its own challenges. But tonight, you can simply rest, your journey through the pirate era complete, your understanding enriched by truth rather than fantasy. The wind still whispers across empty seas, carrying no messages now, disturbing no sails, touching no one. The stars still wheel overhead in their ancient patterns, marking time's passage with indifferent precision. And somewhere, in the deep places where light never penetrates, the bones of long-dead pirates rest in silent darkness, their struggles finished, their stories told, their lives finally, mercifully at peace. Close your eyes now. Let the weight of history settle gently around you like a blanket, not oppressive but strangely comforting in its reminder that you are part of a great continuity, that your life is connected to all the lives that came before and all that will come after. Let the stories of Thomas and his fellow pirates fade into the background of your consciousness, not forgotten but no longer demanding your active attention. Let yourself drift, secure in the knowledge that you are here, now, safe and warm, far removed from the harsh realities of the distant age. The horrible life of pirates is over. It ended long ago, and those who lived it have found whatever peace awaits us all. We've remembered them tonight, honored them by seeing them clearly rather than through the distorting lens of romance. And now we can let them rest, and rest ourselves, our duty to historical truth fulfilled, our journey through this dark chapter of history complete. Good night, dear friend. Thank you for walking this path with me through the shadows of the past. May your dreams be gentler than the reality we've explored, and may you wake tomorrow to a world that, for all its flaws, offers you opportunities and securities that pirates could never have imagined. The story is ended. The dreaming goes on. And in that dreaming, perhaps, we find a kind of peace that eluded the desperate men who sailed under black flags on wine-dark seas, seeking freedom and finding only another kind of prison. Sleep now. The watch is over. The voyage is complete. Rest comes at last, as it comes to all things, gentle and inevitable as the tide.